Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Ed BRUBAKER's in the house, Jimmy. Big bibliography. Why don't you hit us with some highlights and let's get the show on the road.
Should have recorded the bibliography ahead of time as like a monologue. Starts out as an indie creator. We know him from Low Life. Looked at that on a previous episode. Goes to DC. Catwoman with Darwin Cook. How about that for a revamp? Gotham Central with Michael Lark. Marvel Comics, Captain America, Winter Soldier, Daredevil, Iron Fist, X-Men. This is all who's who, and then he goes and starts doing creator-own work. So we get things like recently Reckless and Pulp, Killer Be Killed, Criminal. I think people know that one. Velvet, Fade Out, Fatal. I could go on and on.
Yeah, you're going to embarrass
Unbelievable.
the man. Ed, thanks for coming by, man.
I like how I forgot about a bunch of those.
here's the question. You know, we asked Brian K. Vaughan the question, and he also said he was your nemesis, man. So maybe you could have a clarifying answer. Tell us, in fact, it's not a question. Tell us what's so much cooler about comics than Hollywood. We're taking notes, by the way.
Fuck. So many things. It's funny, when I first moved out to LA to work in like film and TV, because I'd been flying down from Seattle like a couple times a year for meetings about stuff that never happened. And I just thought, all right, I'm gonna have to just be there to make it happen somehow, which, you know, great success, whatever. Like that didn't work either. But I remember the first week I was there, I went out to lunch with Brian and Robert Kirkman, and they both were like, what are you doing? You do great in comics. Like, you're crazy to want to be in a writing room, and you don't even understand the freedom that you'll be giving up, et cetera, which are like two of the most successful like TV people that I know. So I was like, uh-oh, what's going on here? And I just thought, you guys just know some secret. You want to keep me out of the clubhouse. I remember like a year or two later, I was like, you guys were so right. You know, it's great. I've been up from 5:30 this morning, like writing comics, and you know, I'm on one Hollywood job right now, but it's you know, mostly it's writing actually, and like talking to other writers or rewriting what they're writing a little bit. So it's not so much the giant time suck of a writer's room. Our whole writer's room for this Batman cartoon was only 6 weeks long. And about 3 weeks of it was really intensive, and the rest of it was like breaking the episodes into outlines. So it was very work related, and, you know, felt almost close to comics in a way, because it's cartoons.
The guy who was making Low Life comics, was he preparing for this? Like, did you foresee this? Was this part of the plan? I mean, frankly, was he even working for the Big Two part of the plan? Because you seem pretty entrenched in the indie scene.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up as like I guess I was mostly a Marvel zombie. I was like one of those Marvel zombie kids who read everything Marvel put out and then read like 4 things DC put out. Like I would always pick up like Jimmy Olsen books when I'd see them in like the quarter bins or whatever. And I liked Batman, and Legion of Superheroes hit at the exact right time of my childhood, I guess, when you discover like the way Mike Grell draws like the back of someone's calves on someone's arms, like, and the weird costume designs. Like there were some DC books I was super into, but yeah, from the time I discovered like underground and independent comics and what we called alternative comics back then, I don't think I had any desire. I went from wanting to like, when I was a kid, I wanted to like pencil the X-Men, which I didn't even really like the X-Men. It was more like everybody was just into the X-Men when I was a little kid. And I remember I would buy it all the time, and I would just think, there's so many characters I can't. And I was like super into Spider-Man and like Daredevil, characters like that. But yeah, by the time I was a teenager, I had no desire to like write stuff like that. And even when I got my first job writing a superhero comic, I was trying to talk the editor out of hiring me, because I was like, I don't have any stories. I don't have any Batman ideas. And, you know, here I am 20 something years later. But he was like, well, you just wrote a mystery comic for us. If you can write a mystery, you can write a Batman story. He's the world's greatest detective. And I thought about it. My first pitch was like, Batman gets addicted to speed. So, you know.
That was the feisty 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
See that fit in there.
That's such an interesting perspective on Batman, because I never think of Batman as mystery. Obviously, the detective is all we hear about, but that implies solving of mysteries, and it's kind of a different genre, and certainly one, Ed, that you know very well and have
Yeah.
talked about, written in. Interesting to apply like mystery to Batman.
I thought you were going to
Well,
say
it's-
the speed part, man, because a guy who
Yeah.
needs some no-dos to stalk the night. I get it.
Yeah, he doesn't really want to sleep, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that was the most fun for me working for like Marvel and DC. I mean, actually, I had a much more fun in some ways. At DC, like doing Catwoman and Gotham Central, like when I was working in the Bat Office for like 5 years or whatever, and we got to revamp Catwoman completely. Like they offered me that book and I was trying to turn it down. And so I came up with a bunch of reasons like, well, you wouldn't let me do this or you wouldn't let me do this. And the editor was like, do all of that. And I was like, well, we need a new artist. We need to redesign her. I don't want it to be like this women in prison thing and all exploitative. And so I keep trying to talk them out of hiring me for things. And then they would hire me anyway. That was kind of how I got in at Vertigo. Like I had pitched a bunch of Vertigo-y like things because I wanted to pay my rent. And it was like me trying to be like Neil Gaiman or Garth Ennis or something. It wasn't really me. And I remember telling Shelley Roberg at the time, who's Shelley Bond now, I was like, I just feel like the kind of stuff I want to do, you guys won't be interested in. And she's like, well, what is this thing that you want to do that's so different than what we do? And I'm like, just like a mystery comic with like a private eye. Because I was just really obsessed with like Ross McDonald books and Raymond Chandler at that point. And I just wanted to see if I could do something like that in the American market. And it was like approved a week later. So I was like, oh, fuck, they called my bluff. Now I got to actually do this. And it started like a whole career in a way. But like when you're actually writing Batman, you can't really have Batman solving mysteries too much. It's it doesn't leave enough room for him swinging around and fighting. Like fans always talk about him being this great detective, but they want like 1 page of that and like 19 pages of cool Batman shit. Especially the artists are like, yeah, maybe not so many pages of Bruce Wayne talking to people. Those don't sell as well.
I like lingering on this mystery thing for a minute because I always say like I don't really believe in too many rules when it comes to comics. Let's apply it to the only thing I care about.
Yeah.
But I say don't be boring and don't be confusing, and there are of course exceptions to both of those, and the exception to don't be confusing is the mystery. And it would be, again, I think of Batman as being the one where that would be really interesting and probably frustrating to readers if you were halfway through the Batman story and it was kind of like, I'm not sure what's going on or how we got here or who I can trust.
Yeah. It's a weird thing to work on. When I was there, we had like this group. It was me and Greg Rucka and Devin Grayson and Chuck Dixon. I think that was the 4 of us. And I can't remember who was writing. Somebody was writing Batgirl at the time. And we would have these summits like once a year where we'd sort of map out what everybody was doing and when we were going to converge for an event or something. And we did this event where Bruce Wayne got accused of murder. And it went on for like 1.5 years or something like that, which I was just kind of blown away that they did it. But it became much less fun to do because it was like, Bruce Wayne breaks out of prison, Batman's full time. And it just became like a long running event. And it just kind of killed my enthusiasm for that part of it, because it was like, well, it's not either thing kind of. It's like the fun of Batman is like the weirdness of this fucking like, well, now they always say he's a billionaire. Back then we called him a multimillionaire. Just seemed a little bit more down to earth. But yeah, he's like, going out and solving these crimes. He's like this it's like, you can see why comic fans love him. He's like this guy who obviously can't get over his childhood. And it's like, here we all are surrounded by our, yeah. So you can see why comic fans are super into Batman, but, it was a fun time to be there. But yeah, them letting us revamp Catwoman and letting us do Gotham Central, where you could actually do mystery stories, because Batman's only in like a panel or two, like that was way more fun.
Let's talk Catwoman for a minute and your collaborator, Darwin Cook. Do you have any good Darwin Cook stories for us?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that we could fill an hour and a half with that. Yeah, that was a crazy one. I had seen a few pages of Batman Ego internally, like years before it got published. I don't know if he was working on that over the course of a long time or they were just trying to figure out how to get approval to publish it because it was so weird. Um, Bruce Timm recently told me a good Darwin story, which was that when he was working on the cartoons for them, he went to like WonderCon or something, or some LA convention to show his sample pages to editors, and he showed Archie Goodwin his stuff, and Archie Goodwin was like, "Oh, this stuff's good, but it's a lot like the Batman animated show. You should go talk to the guys running like the kids side of DC." And then he showed it to someone else. I can't remember who, like Walt Simonson or somebody, who was like, "Oh my God, this work is amazing. You got to show this stuff to Archie." And he brought Darwin back over to Archie. And Darwin was like, "No, no, 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 wait." And Archie Goodwin was like, "Oh, wait. So I said it's not what we're looking for. So you tried to go to someone else to." Which I was just like, wow, Archie Goodwin being like the hammer is like, because you always hear of him as like the sweetest guy in comics ever. And, you know, I remember him when I used to work at booths at the convention, like when I was a teenager. Like he would remember me from year to year and we would talk about comics and he would give me like writing tips and stuff. But the idea of Archie Goodwin being like the guy who's like, "Listen, son," I was just like, wow, that must have hurt. That's like worse than getting one of those angry postcards from Alex Toth where he's like ripping you apart for, you know, being great at what you do. But yeah, Darwin, just he happened to be sharing a studio with like Chip Zdarsky and Cameron Stewart and these other people that I knew. Cameron was like our inker on Dead Enders. And so Cameron brought me over to meet him. And I had just been given Catwoman like the week before that. And I was trying to figure out how to revamp the costume and the look and what the book was going to be like. And they just came over and I started talking to Darwin and I was like, "Hey, what are you working on now?" And he had that big Justice League thing he did, New Frontier. He'd already drawn, I think, the first issue or so, but there was like this long contract negotiation going on. And so he had this window of time. And I just said, "Look, you know, why don't you help me revamp the character? We'll redesign it. We'll, you know, launch this new thing. You do the first storyline and then you go back to your other thing. Does that have any interest to you?" And he was super up for it because, you know, he hadn't actually been published yet. No one really knew who he was. So I just kind of met him early and we liked a lot of the same books and stuff. And when we talk about comics art, you know, he was like, you know, like you guys and me, like I get the sense there's a whole generation of us who grew up just kind of obsessing about everything about comics. But like I could be on a phone call with him and, you know, looking at back then you'd have to have things like faxed or photocopied and sent to you. And I'd be looking at like character sketches that the editor had mailed me. And I'm like, "Oh, your ink line here looks kind of like Lee Elias." And he'd be like, "Lee Elias? How do you know who that is?" And I'm like, "I'm a comic book guy. Of course I know." But it was like, it was amazing to have that kind of collaborator who he didn't always follow the script, but you never cared. Because it's like if I would say, "Oh, she's on the top of a moving train and she leaps off and jumps onto the police station," and he'll turn that into like a 4-page sequence. And I was like, "Oh wow, that was supposed to be 1 page." But you know, it looks amazing and it's got this awesome double page spread. And you know, he took the ideas that I had for the Catwoman revamp and just, you know, I think within a day was like sketching, you know, what she would look like with the belt, with her whip as her belt, like down around her hips. And he gave it this really cool, you know, retro vibe. All I said was like aviator mask with, you know, goggles and cat ears. And my wife had pointed out that Emma Peel wore what was called a cat suit. And I'm like, "Oh, well, we have to put her in a cat suit," obviously. But the idea was to try to make her look, you know, like sexy, but not sexist. And so he was super down with that. And he did character design pages. I think some of them are reprinted in some of the DC books, but he did full like animation, you know, turnaround design character stuff for all the major characters. It was kind of amazing to see. No one I'd ever worked with had done that before.
Do you ever provide thumbnails for people that you work with?
When I first started doing comics, I would do that. I would either at the bottom of the page, I would draw like the grid and like some basic compositions, or I would actually do like my version of, you know, here's where the character should be and all that stuff. And I remember Michael Lark saying, "Don't do that. That's like the fun part." And I realized that was why I was trying to do it, because like I love comics and I loved like drawing comics. I feel like I spent like half of my life drawing comics while not ever being satisfied with what I did. But like the layouts and the inking were the only parts that were fun. Everything else was work. And so I was like trying to take one of the fun parts away from them. I write scripts for other artists. I mean, I only work with two. I work with Marcos Martin and Sean Phillips now, so I know exactly who I'm working for. But I write scripts for them, not much more detailed than I wrote scripts for myself. I'll indicate if something needs to be a full tier, or if we're like over someone's shoulder looking at something else, or in like their POV. I thought early on I would be like that Harvey Kurtzman kind of thing where you do all the sketches for everybody, but then you read interviews with all those guys and so many of them were so frustrated by that too. Like Wally Wood's like, I don't need you to tell me how to draw a comic book page, Harvey.
It's interesting how much you, like talking about Darwin Cook, whenever you get this Catwoman revamp assignment and you kind of reach out to him early on as like, let's collaborate on this. When I think of like the Cartoonist, and you know, you're coming from this, you're the writer artist of Low Life, and you know, you start out as this cartoonist. I think of us as all being antisocial and control freaks and all of these things. And you know, not only are you collaborating with artists, but you've co-written with a number of writers, which that doesn't always happen. That's kind of rare. How has that experience been? Is that something that's natural for you? Did you have to kind of work to like, you know, trust that process with another creator?
It's pretty rare for me because I'm like a total control freak. You know, I like to see even like layouts and pencils and stuff on a lot of stuff so I can give possible feedback. Though everybody, I mean, I'm working with two of the best artists in comics now, so I don't have these issues. But in the old days, like sometimes you'd be working with a foreign artist for like a Marvel book. When I wrote the X-Men, one of my artists, English was not his first language at all. I think Malaysian maybe. And I had written that a character was walking down the hall of a spaceship moping, and he drew him mopping, which is hilarious because there's, you know, hermetically sealed spaceship. He had like with a mop and a bucket. And I was just like, the hilarious thing was that it was so close to deadline that Marvel almost wanted to publish it anyway. I was like, no. We cannot have a guy with a mop and a bucket on the spaceship. I go off on tangents a lot.
That's fine, and I can update this to a very specific another example of maybe the cartoonist antisocial behavior that we exhibit from time to time. I heard in another interview with you tell this story about when Gotham Central was coming up and you were figuring out titles and pitching it to Janet Kahn. I wonder if you could tell us about Janet Kahn, because I've never heard anybody talk about her in any of our interviews, and I think of her historically as like some really influential things that she at least was connected to. What was your experience working with her? Can you talk about her and her contribution to comics at all?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we were able to call it Gotham Central is because of that meeting that we were at. Like, everybody loved the idea of the book, of me and Greg and Michael doing this thing about the Gotham cops, but they didn't want to let us call it Gotham Central because they thought the title sounded boring. And so I sketched out the logo with like the police badge and everything. And she had showed up for a Batman summit. I think the one where we were doing that Bruce Wayne murderer thing. And she sat next to me. And I was just like, I'm going to take advantage of this. So I like, there was a moment we were talking about the book and I said, and we want to call it Gotham Central. And here's the logo. And she was like, oh, that's great. And I remember Mike Carlin had been pushing us to call it Gotham Murder City. Which I was like, for one thing, Detroit is Murder City. But that was an interesting thing where it was like, I I guess I got lucky. No one, we didn't get in trouble for it, but technically like going over your boss and his boss's head to the head of the company is not really done. But I was just like, again, like Cartoonist, such a control freak. Here, Greg and I have figured out a way to do this book in a control freak way, actually, where we're going to team up once a year on a story and then each do our own thing so we get out of each other's way in case, we devised a method to work together as two people who usually are used to working alone. So I just was so desperate for the book to be what we wanted it to be. Like, we waited around for a year to get Michael Lark to draw it, and they were pitching other artists to us, and we were like, no, it's got to be Michael. And he was on some Hawkman thing that was taking him forever. But yeah, Jeanette was I thought she was a lot of fun. She was a bit kooky. Like, her best friend in life apparently is Quincy Jones. And yeah, she ran with like this whole other crowd. Like, Greg once got her to bring him to lunch with Gloria Steinem when he was taking over Wonder Woman and wanted to talk to Gloria Steinem about Wonder Woman. So she was like, her Rolodex was kind of insane. For years after I left DC, at Comic-Con, I'd end up like out to lunch with her and some executive for like some film production company she was trying to get going to like sell DC stuff to like movies and TV shows, like the Vertigo stuff where they still sort of controlled it. But yeah, I always thought she was for everything that you heard about her, she was like this bizarre combination of really, really sharp, had really, really great instincts about things, but also came across as a little bit kind of, I don't want to say flighty, but like she had a big life. Like, you always got the sense you were in the middle of two different things that she was, taking care of. So it was a really interesting thing to have her attention for a while. Like, I think she really liked a lot of the stuff I did for Vertigo, and she really liked Gotham Central, and she really liked Catwoman. I've been lucky in that the people in charge of the companies when I worked there basically just said, let Ed do whatever the hell he wants, which is not, there's a probably 5 or 10 people in my generation who got that kind of privilege, like Bendis and Hickman and other people who just sort of get to have fun. But yeah, on the, writing with other people, like Matt and I co-writing Iron Fist was really fun, actually. Because we would, God, this was so long ago, but remember back when PlayStation 2 or 3 was like a big deal, and like a lot of us would play Call of Duty at night, like because we would work until late and then jump on Call of Duty at like 11. There was like this whole group of comic book people, and we would just do these private rooms because if we went in a public room, the kids would just kill us. And did they do that like thing where they're fucking like dropping their balls on you after bagging your corpse? And we had a thing where we would only count kills if you shot each other in the butt. And so every now and then, if we were playing with regular people, we'd shoot them in the butt, and we'd be like, in the butt, and be like, hey man, what's going on here? It was like, oh, sorry, that's our little thing. But Matt and I would like, he was living in Kansas City at the time and I was in Seattle. And so we would spend mornings playing Rockstar table tennis, which he kicked my ass at repeatedly, and just plot out Iron Fist that way. And then we would break it down into who was writing what scenes, which was very similar to how Greg and I wrote for Gotham Central when we teamed up. We would plot out the thing on the phone. It would take Greg and I about an hour or two on the phone to plot out an issue of Gotham Central. And then we would break it down who was writing what. And then we would race to see who got their half of the script done first, because whoever got their half done last had to do all the transitions and smooth out everything. And I always was last because I actually am obsessive about transitions. So I was like, fine. I'll make sure these page turns make sense.
Go ahead. Do you attribute your interest in transitions to any particular books or writers or sources?
Alan Moore in particular?
Yeah, probably Alan Moore, but also like the Hernandez brothers and I don't know, Eisner probably to some degree. I mean, I was a huge comic nerd growing up. Like, I'm assuming you guys didn't have a lot of friends, and like I look back on my life like 10 years ago. I was looking back at my youth and suddenly realized I'm like, oh shit, I had like a severe anxiety disorder. I never even realized it, because most of my time I just tried to spend indoors, like reading comics or drawing comics, or trying to come up with ideas for my own comics. And like the times of the year that I would look forward to would be like, I grew up partly in San Diego, so I would really look forward to Comic-Con and going and meeting other cartoonists and stuff. So I was like obsessive about comic storytelling from the time I was like 10 or 11 years old. I was like all those Eisner books about storytelling, and I had that fucking Winsor McKay anatomy book with all the incorrect anatomy. But I remember showing some sketches to someone, like Paul Smith, I think. I showed like a thing to when I was like 13, and he's like, you got to get rid of that Winsor McKay book, man. People don't look like this. But yeah, I was just obsessed with all that stuff. So I think a lot of it comes from, there is that definite era in Alan Moore, like right up until like after he's done with Watchmen, when he stopped caring so much. But for a while, where all of his page turns and transition moments from scene to scene, even on a page, he was always trying to do that kind of matching thing. Or like when he was doing Swamp Thing, and he would like open a story with an issue with some kind of repetitive monologue, and then come back to it at the end, like bookends or stuff like that. I remember talking to Archie Goodwin about that, actually. Like those first couple Alan Moore Swamp Things, was because he was asking me who my favorite comic book writer was, and I was like, well, like everybody else, it's Alan Moore right now. And he's like, what do you like about him? I'm like, I think he's the most original comic book writer that I've encountered in my lifetime. And he said, actually, he's not. And he's like, originality is completely overrated. What Alan Moore is doing is he's telling, he's like, there's only 5 stories in the world, and it's just about how you tell that story is what makes it, your story and your style. And he's like, Alan Moore is bringing in, more literary style to telling these same kind of stories that, everybody else has been telling. He's like, the original thing about Alan Moore is how he brings you into and out of a story, and the parts that he concentrates on. And I was like, oh, wow. That kind of blew my mind at like 15.
I'm glad you're talking about 15, because I do want to talk about a lot more of your current work, but I want to talk about that like late 80s, early 90s, when you're in the indie scene.
Yeah.
Who were your people then? Did you have like a peer group? Like, I don't know, people
in San Diego. In San Diego, I didn't really have a peer group.
You were kicking it with Scott Shaw?
Scott came into the comic store I worked at, actually. I heard someone tell Scott Shaw, I don't know if this is a 100% true story, but I know a comic dealer in LA who said, yeah, Scott Shaw said he used to buy weed from you. And I was like, I don't think so. Like, I never was a weed dealer, but maybe I hooked Scott up with weed at a Comic-Con once. I don't like, I have no memory of that. But also when comic dealers tell you things, they may not be true. But yeah, a lot of these guys would come to our, like when I was in high school, I went to this high school in San Diego called Crawford, and Scott Shaw and Tom Pound, or is it Tom Pound?
John Pound.
The guy who drew the cartoon bunny. No.
John Pound was like the Garbage Pail Kids guy.
Yeah, John Pound. Yeah, he had gone to my high school. A bunch of these guys had all gone to my high school, and so some of them would come back and like lecture at the school. And like I remember Greg Bear coming and lecturing our creative writing class. And I think Scott Shaw came to our school one day, and he was like doing storyboards for animation at the time. But yeah, I had a couple of friends who I was clearly like the one who was way more into comics than them, but they were all very talented artists. A lot of them ended up becoming like tattoo artists and stuff. But there wasn't really like an alternative comic scene there that I could grasp the way there was in like when I went up to the Bay Area. There were a lot more people that you would meet who were doing their own zines or self-publishing comics. And that was where I started meeting, you know, more and more people. But I also met a lot of people, you know, going to Comic-Con all the time as a kid. Like I met the Hernandez brothers when I was like 14 or 15, and Dan Clowes. And, you know, at the time, I think I thought, oh, I'm making friends with all these guys. And I think in their mind, I was like this sort of weird tag-along kid who they couldn't get rid of, who would show up drunk at their parties and make a fool of himself. But to me, I was like around my heroes.
And do you still pay attention to their works, the works happening in the indie scene and all that?
Yeah, a lot of it. You know, the guys from my era don't do as much stuff anymore. I mean, Jaime and Gilbert still do. I think Jaime's actually doing the best work of his career the last probably 2 decades, which I'm surprised to say because he was so good from the beginning. A lot more of the alternative stuff is all graphic novels now. You know, like even you guys, you know, put out mostly. I mean, Jim, you did that Super Mag, and I remember seeing that, and I was like, oh, this looks like something that would have been on the newsstand or in the music store in like 1992, like next to roller derby or something. I remember I was obsessed with that. I was like, man, he did this magazine that was completely like as if it was just yet another thing. It was like an artifact of a bygone era. I totally like that was one of my main inspirations for doing those criminal magazines, was like, I want to do something like that but in criminal.
Those are cool. I tracked those down after they were after the fact, and that was those were sweet.
Yeah, the letters pages and all that. So I did so much research. Like a lot of my responses in the letters page are just like paraphrased from things Roy Thomas actually would write in third person. Asking girls to send in pictures of themselves in bikinis and stuff. I was like, wow.
It's a different era, man. Like one of the videos we didn't put up yet, man, is Red Sonja, and there's like a co-writer lady in there, and I need to know the story behind that because this lady never wrote anything else ever. They're talking about Red Sonja conventions, and I'm like, what is Roy Thomas up to, man? Like, who is this lady? Like, so something's going on here.
Roy was a player, man. Maybe.
It's interesting doing research into comics. Like one of the things that I've been noticing lately is we look at like Golden Age stuff or magazines, you know, like 70s era magazines and stuff. That stuff just gets erased from comics history. You know, even Charlton, it feels like this stuff doesn't have a voice anymore that's preserving it. And it's such a bummer if you're like a comics historian that
I've started doing a thing in my newsletter, which I haven't done an update on it in like a year on this part of it, but I was trying to do a thing just going back through my own memories of like significant comics of my life from the time when I was like, because I think I saw comics for the first time when I was like 2 or 3. I remember my dad bringing home this giant box of comics from he had asked all the guys at his office in Navy intelligence when we were living in Gitmo, I think, if their kids had any comics they didn't want anymore. And so he brought this huge box of, you know, partly uncovers and, you know, like just in shit condition. I've never cared about the condition of comics. And my brother and I just fought over this box of comics. And that was when I got obsessed with like Spider-Man. I think the first comic I ever read was like the early issue of the Fantastic Four where the Submariner and Doctor Doom team up and shoot the Baxter building into outer space.
It's a good issue.
And then I just read that. Yeah, it's a great issue, actually. That's my favorite era of Kirby art, actually. I get a lot of flack for liking the late 50s to mid 60s Kirby more than the late 60s to mid 70s Kirby.
That's the Hernandez Bros favorite stuff.
I just love the way he drew people. Yeah, I mean, no one drew people just walking around in clothes. Everything looked tweed, and you know, everybody looked like natural. Like he was an amazing naturalist, actually, and that whole period is forgotten. People talk about Alex Toth all the time, and I love Toth, but I never empathized with a character in Toth, whereas I empathized with characters in Kirby all the time because his facial expressions were better, you know, and you just felt like the characters moved in more different angles and just felt a little bit more alive, depending on who was inking him, I guess. but yeah, like ever since that, like comics was my first, I think my first, almost one of my first memories is that box of comics. So like I was obsessed with comics my whole life. So I've been trying to sort of go through like what were the most significant ones to me, because I feel like my educational path is so different than modern comics people. Like when I talk to a lot of people now, other than like people who are students of like James and Jason's, you know, Cartoon Center for Cartoon Studies, who have a wide range of influences from their library and stuff. But I feel like when I was growing up, it was hard to find old comics, and you hunted for things. There was like this passion of like going to the library and trying to find like, oh my God, here's a thing of Prince Valiance from, you know, 1935, or, you know, it was like a big thing to like try to discover different kinds of comics. And, you know, I always feel like with the information age, people don't appreciate as much like that whole thing of like the joy of the search and finding stuff, and not having everything immediately at your fingertips makes you appreciate it a little bit more somehow. But I would, you know, obsessively like, you go through these phases where it's like, oh, I'm super obsessed with Spider-Man, so I'm drawing like tons of Spider-Man like rip-off characters in my sketchbooks. And I think when I was in like ninth grade or eighth grade, someone brought like a bunch of Robert Crumb comics to school, because there was this little newsstand next to the San Diego Zoo. There was like this little path you walk from the zoo to Balboa Park, and these people used to set up little stands and sell stuff. And this guy was selling underground comics for a while, and he would just sell them to fucking anybody apparently, because he sold them to like a seventh grader. And this guy had like Mr. Natural, and I remember looking through Mr. Natural and being like amazed by the art, but also like really freaked out by it. And like you get that weird feeling in your stomach, like I don't think I'm supposed to be reading this. And you know, like when you sneak heavy metal into the house for the first time because you're worried your parents will find it and, you know, send you to Catholic school or something. But yeah, I remember when I first discovered those and realizing comics could be in black and white was like a huge deal, because it's, of course, as a kid when you're drawing comics too, the best thing is when you discover like somebody who's really great in comics who you don't feel like is also the greatest artist in the world. Like that's why I think Frank Miller is so amazing. Like Frank Miller has a very limited art style, and he just does so much with it that for me, like as a kid discovering his work, I was just like, oh my God, maybe someone who has as limited skills as me could still do this.
We talked about that before. Like there was this issue, like in the early '90s when we were kids. On the strength of the Tales from the Crypt TV show, there was newsstand distribution for like Ross Cochran reprints, and they would gang it up in 64-page chunks. So it would be 2 issues of stuff. It would be a horror book is the front cover, but then you get to the centerfold, and it would be like weird fantasy or like one of those like, you know, lesser selling titles. And looking at Wally Wood's work on The Exile in this one sci-fi story, like I always wanted to be in comics myself. I was always obsessed, but when I like saw that and thought like, oh, so you have to draw like this in order to get to draw comics, like it's hopeless, it's over. Like I was copying, you know, like Todd McFarlane and shit like that. But then you see that, it's like, oh man, first off, this stuff is incredible. I would love to do this. I can't do it. It'll never happen.
I have that tote there, the Wally Wood artist edition. That's like the biggest one they ever made because it's double up size, and it's got like all the overlay layers. And I'm just like I'll keep that for the rest of my life because it's just amazing to think about. Of course, no wonder he killed himself. Like how hard was that? And he was probably getting like $35 a page.
Yeah, he bled for those comics, no doubt, man.
Yeah, and he had a lot of assistants too. But you know, I mean, when you're having 9 layers of Zipatone on one page, and then it's going to be colored too, like holy fucking shit. Yeah, those guys are the best. My favorite of all the ECs is Johnny Craig, actually. I was like so thrilled when Fantagraphics started putting out the single collections of Craig, because he's like one of the few who also wrote his own stuff most of the time. And I just, you know, I still go back and read those stories and get a ton out of them. But his ink line is just fucking amazing, you know.
Love that one, man. And now that we have those like double up artist editions. There's the one that collects like the one crime story where he's got the thumbprints
Right.
all over it, and I'm like, oh,
Oh,
man,
yeah.
we could steal Johnny Craig's identity.
Yeah.
his life-size
true.
thumbprint.
That's really funny. I didn't think about that. Yeah. All these artists who use their thumbprints in their art.
Are you still a comics collector, Ed?
I'm not a collector of anything anymore, primarily just because I got to this age where just having, I was a hardcore, like, I wasn't a single issue collector. I was more of like, once something got collected in a book, I would save it. I still have a huge book collection. This is not my full collection behind me here. I have a bunch of stuff in storage, and we have a rental house in LA that has like 5 times as many books in it. So I guess I'm a collector, but I don't think of myself that way. Like, there's very few books where I'm like, oh, I need to get a copy of that. You know, a lot of times if I read something, unless I feel like I'm like, I love it enough that I want to read it again, or that I know I'm going to keep going back to it, then, you know, I might put it in my give it to the library pile now. But I'm in my mid 50s now. Like, when my dad died like 10 years ago, he had so many books. His whole, every space on his wall in his house was a bookcase. And like, his wife went through hell trying to get, first she tried to get me and my brother to take them all, and we were like, no, we already have that disease. We don't need all of Dad's weird first editions that he was constantly trading up for. But yeah, it took her years to get rid of all that stuff. And I just was like, I don't want to, I want to have less stuff when I die than I do now. But I still follow, a lot of stuff. I read, it's rare if like a great graphic novel comes out and I'm not like picking it up, or have heard it or being anticipating it. I follow, a lot of the younger cartoonists. It's easy if you now, because the internet, you can keep up with like who's hot or who's doing really good work. I was as one of the originators of the Ignatz Award. I remember like 10 years ago or so, when every single person who won it was a woman cartoonist. I was like, holy fucking shit. I was like so proud to have been even the smallest part of that. But I was just like, holy shit, like the women in alternative comics have basically taken over.
How did that work out, Ed? You were part of SPX in the early rounds or something?
No, Chris Orr was one of the organizers of SPX, and I think he was working with Top Shelf at the time, or whatever Chris Staros's company was before Top Shelf, before he merged or bought Top Shelf or whatever happened there. And I just met those guys at like some of the indie press conventions, and it's hilarious because, like, at the time I was just thinking the Eisners and the Harveys really just end up feeling like they're dominated by mainstream comics. And I thought like alternative comics should have an award that was really just aimed at people who like wrote and drew their own books, really, like, because like, why, as other than Chris Ware, it felt like, nobody outside of Marvel and DC was ever winning any of these other awards. And so I just suggested to them as a way to help SPX become like more of a festival or something, that they have like some kind of award, and suggested calling it the Ignatz and giving away like a brick, actually, which amazingly, I was joking when I said it, but then he, like, the next day he's like, I got a guy who can make the bricks. And I'm like, holy shit. Like, and it's a brick with engraving on it. So I was like, oh, wow. And I was on the jury the first year. That's why I was so mad when Frank Cho nominated himself for everything, because I helped codify the rules for it. And the number one rule was like, you're not allowed to know who else is on the jury, and you're not allowed to nominate your own work, because like, if someone else nominates you, like, wonderful. But, if you're not, it just feels like so sleazy to nominate yourself for something, or even vote for yourself almost. Though, that one's up to the individual, but I felt like that was super douchey. But yeah, I started that with him, and then he made it a festival award, so you had to like be there to vote for it, which I thought was kind of cool. Though it limits the amount of people, probably as many people vote in that as vote in the Eisners or the Harveys anyway, really. But yeah, it was interesting that that's gone on to be like a pretty cool indie comics award that I could never possibly win now.
New issue of Low Life, man. So you're saying it's never going to
Yeah.
happen?
Well, I mean, the funny thing was, like, not long after that, I started winning Eisner Awards. So I was like, all right, well, fuck it. I don't have to figure out how to explain to security why I'm bringing a brick onto the plane.
What was Aeon Press?
Oh my God. Aeon Press was, Ed Vick was the publisher of Moo Comics, and those were all like funny animal comics. And Caliber Press, where I had started publishing Low Life, I think. Yeah, because I'd done a book at Slave Labor, and then I was going to do Low Life there, and then they didn't want it. And so Mike Allred had gone from Slave Labor to Caliber, and he asked me if I wanted to go over there and talk to them. And so I like had a phone call with the guy at Caliber and published Low Life there. And then I tried to get him to start like a whole other line of like indie comics, where it was this line called Monkey Wrench. And oh no, that was what I wanted to call it. What did they call it? It was like Iconographics or something, which was like way too close to Fantagraphics. But it was like the first place like Jason Lutz and Dame Darcy and like several other like really good like indie comics people like sort of discovered their mini comics and asked them if they wanted to be part of this line. And then that all kind of blew up, so I needed a new publisher. And Fantagraphics turned me down in a really, really kind of mean letter from Kim Thompson. Classic Kim Thompson mean letter. Nice to your face, total dick to your back. Like, I can't remember who recommended it, but basically someone was like, oh, hey, Ed Vick is starting like a non-funny animal like line. You should go over there. And so I went over and talked to him and basically just agreed to publish it with him. And I did like 2 or 3 issues with him. And I don't know if anything else ever got published under, I think there's some weird comic, like something Peach, the Desert Peach, about like it's like a World War II lesbian comic. Yeah, I think he published that and Low Life, and that was about it. Maybe I don't remember anything else coming. Maybe a couple like one-shot alternative comics came out. But yeah, it was just a real small publisher. Like he had another job. He was like a manager at like Half Price Books in Seattle, like around the corner from his house, and I would show up at his house and we'd shoot photo stats of the pages like back in the old days. But there was like multiple distributors back then. So those books actually sold pretty well.
What a different landscape that was. We talked a lot about that whole 90s, all the distributors going away, following SPX and stuff, like following all that, like self-publishing. There was a lot of momentum for that, Spirits of Independence and stuff. And then, I don't know, 95, somewhere around there, Marvel goes to Heroes World and all the distributors just collapse.
Yeah, that consolidation really sucked. The first time I tried to publish a comic in the mid 80s, there was like 25 distributors or something like that. Like even if you were doing shitty, you could still sell 10,000 copies. Like Blackthorn Press was selling like 20 or 40,000 copies of everything they published just by knowing how to like reach the distributors, because there were so many. And I worked at Bud Plant Distributing in San Diego they had like a San Diego branch for about a year before they sort of went smaller or got bought out by Diamond or whatever happened to them. And like we had like a rental house that was our warehouse, but like distributors would stock stuff back then, so stores could come in and like we had like the little Lulu libraries and all the like Karl Barks like hardbacks and all that stuff, like these hugely expensive books, but like stores would come in and they'd be like, oh great, you got it. And so it was like, but San Diego also had like 40 comic book stores at that point. Probably still amazing to me that comic stores are a huge thing. As much as they're still like a huge part of the market, and that I think all of us have been predicting our entire lives that they were about to go away. They just had their best 2 years ever in the midst of the worst time of humanity.
Yeah, it's incredible when you hear, like, not just comics, but brick and mortar retailers in general, you know, facing terrible present. And it's like you said, the last 2 years, the reports from the comic shops are good. It's astounding.
Well, when you have this sense of suddenly, I remember the terror of the day when, like, we were sending one of our graphic novels to print the day that Diamond shut down and the printer shut down and I was like, holy fuck. Like, this could, you know, we might have to do this on Kickstarter or something in 6 months. Who knows? Like, I thought every comic store in the country, I thought we'd lose 80% of comic stores or something. And I don't think we lost very many at all. And more have opened up since then. And it's been really interesting because I think a lot of comic stores also make a shit ton of money on, like, mail order sales now. Mm-hmm. So, and I remember the last job that I had before going full-time in comics was at a used bookstore on Castro Street. And we made half of our money, and this is like 1993, 94. We made half of our money selling stuff on the internet in those days even.
Wow.
Where it was like, just like half of my day was spent uploading the details of books to some obscure text-based website. And now it's like you can find any book on the internet. Like, I think so much of all of these stores get support that way, but also that fear as a fan of, like, because as the older you get, the more you just take it for granted. You're just like, oh, like, I used to go to the comic store every Wednesday or every Friday or whenever New Comics Day was. And, you know, as I got older, it was like, oh, once a month I go to the comic store or every couple of months. And, you know, but the second that I thought comic stores were going to go away, I was like ordering shit from my comic stores. I was like, hey, I don't want the things I love in life to actually disappear. And I think, like, bookstores and comic stores are two of those things. Like, I mean, people still fucking went to the movie theaters during the pandemic to, you know, I assume out of some love of going to the movie theater.
I think there was a lot of reactive stuff of, like, just looking for that Linus safety blanket around that period of time where people were just chasing some sort of levity, some sort of good feelings, because a lot of things increased. Like, trading card sales started to increase. Every like retro video game store, like, got depleted of resources because old heads were going back and, like, buying copies of Contra and shit like that to just try to fill this time at home with you know, your
comfort food for your eyes and stuff.
That's it, man.
Yeah. That's totally, I mean, that's the series that Sean and I are doing now, sprung out of that. Like, I was going back and reading a bunch of, like, you know, crime and pulp novels from the 60s and 70s. And I just was like, I don't want to write the thing. I was about to start writing something that I thought was going to be just too dark and depressing. And, you know, even for us. And I was like, oh, I'll just do, like, a pulp adventure thing. That'll be totally fun and easy. And it's been, you know, it's been really rewarding, but you know, of course I can't do, like, the fun, easy, like, every other page is an explosion. I still have to make it like a meditation on humanity and depression and the end of the world. But it's more fun than what we were going to do.
What was some of that stuff that you were reading in that time? Like, we're talking Spillane, we talking Black Mask reprints or something? Like,
well, going back to, like, the Parker books, I was working with, it's finally coming out, I think in May or June, the second Martini edition of Darwin's Parker books. But when Darwin passed away, like, I didn't know what to do. I didn't go to any of the funerals or the like memorials. I just don't do well at stuff like that. But I wanted to do something for him. And so I just volunteered for me and Sean to sort of be the point people on, like, recollecting all that Parker stuff, and we could, you know, help edit it and design the books and do press for it when it came out to try to sort of push Darwin's, what I think is some of Darwin's best stuff, you know, make sure that stuff survives. And we actually did an original story that's going to be in that second Martini edition that Scott asked us to do something adapting one of the Richard Stark books. And I just couldn't find anything that made sense. I don't know how Darwin would find like a chapter of a book and turn it into a short story the way he did, but I just said, what if I just write like an original thing that's like a tribute to Darwin and Donald Westlake, who, you know, is one of my favorite writers of all time. And so I pitched like an idea, and we had to run it by Abby Westlake, and she wasn't super sold on it. So I had to like write the script on spec and then get permission for Sean to draw it. And she liked this, she liked the script, but once it was drawn, she like was really, really happy with it. And I was just, you know, blown away. I did it just to help Darwin. But you know, I didn't realize I was like the first person that she'd ever given permission to write a Parker story. That's, you know, so I was just like, holy shit. And, you know, for me, it was just a chance to sort of pay tribute to, you know, my friend who's dead. But so because of that, I was like reading all the Parker books again, and like all the, Grofield books, and I went back to reading like Lou Archer novels, and I also spent a lot of time online like looking at like old pulp covers from the 70s, because the covers are usually the best parts of most of those books, as you know. And I tried to read, I still have a bunch of them on the shelf back there that I'm going to try to get through the rest of. My dad's favorite series when I was a kid was the Travis McGee books, which I'd never read any of. And so I tried to read a bunch of those, and they don't hold up as well as I thought they would. Like Lou Archer holds up a lot better, because the Ross McDonald's Lou Archer books, like Archer is such a humanistic character, whereas Travis McGee is just like, he's super pro environment. He's ahead of the curve on everything except feminism. Like every time a woman character comes onto the page, you're just like cringing the whole time as he's describing what her boobs look like and whether Travis wants to fuck her. And you're just like, she's trying to hire him to solve her husband's murder, and he's thinking about fucking her. Yeah, I was kind of partly in reaction to that I was like, I want to write like one of these kind of, you know, 70s pulp heroes and leave all the sexism and bullshit out. You know, all the sexism and sort of unintentional racism. I think a lot of it was just the times, but I wanted to try and write something that felt like it grew out of that world, sort of like our version of what like a paperback pulp hero would have been. And that really was, you know, an escape from just like not wanting to think about the pandemic all the time and not wanting to think about global warming. And you know, so of course I shove all that shit into the books anyway, because, you know, you write about whatever's deep in your head at that moment. But really for, you know, for us, it was like the comics market is completely shut down. We don't know what, we were about to start a comic with single issues and stuff that we were going to collect. And we were enjoying doing these graphic novels. And I thought, well, what if we do one that's twice as long? And then by the time we're done with it, we'll know whether there's a comic market or not. And if there's not, we'll try and, you know, we'll sell it on Kickstarter, or we'll take it to a book publisher or something. And, you know, a couple months into it, the comics market came back, and pulp finally got released and was like the biggest thing that we'd ever done. And, you know, I was blown away by that. So at that point, we were just like, fuck, let's keep doing these Reckless books then, because I think for the entire time Sean and I have been working together, like 20 years now, we've always talked about like Torpedo and Sinner and even Black Sad, kind of just because those look so cool, like these European like detective characters who get to just exist in graphic novels. And we wanted to do something like that, but we never thought that we'd have a big enough audience or the ability to actually just switch from doing single issues to just doing graphic novels. And, you know, like pulp kind of proved like, okay, maybe we can pull this off. And, you know, we had this dead time. So we just, you know, we basically got like one book done before we even really thought about like, is this going to be what we do from now on? And definitely it is, because it's been a huge success. But I also think it stands out in the American market because there are so few people doing that kind of European model where you just follow the character from book to book.
Do you use your newsletter in a big way to promote the works and things? I guess, do you have a big sort of readership that you push that out to on a regular basis, and has that proven effective?
It's hard to say. I think one thing I've learned from the newsletter is I have no idea what the thing people like the most about it is when I put up links to like weird crime stories that catch my eye or that people submit to me. Like those get the most clicks of anything. Like when Marcos and I put out the first issue of Friday on Panel Syndicate, what I discovered is like I can have like 8 or 10,000 newsletter readers, but very few of them actually want to read a digital comic, like even for free. It was like only like 1,000 people clicked on the first one at all, and I was like, holy shit, this is interesting. But I use it kind of because I hate social media. Like I don't want to like at some point during 2016 with the pre-election stuff, I just was like so sick of all social media. So I never had Facebook. I wasted too much time on MySpace, and then everyone was switching to Facebook, and I was like, I don't even like any of this stuff. Fuck it. I don't want to hear from people I went to high school with. And so I was on Twitter for a long time, and I had this moment where I think I, for a couple years, wanted to quit, but I totally just thought about how many hours I'd wasted reading random people's opinions or arguments, or, you know, getting upset about something that doesn't affect me at all, or, you know, that I wouldn't have even known about if I hadn't looked at Twitter at that exact moment. And it just felt like this huge time suck that was just designed to just piss people off. And I just thought, I wish I could get every minute of that back and read a book with it instead, or read like a million books with it. And so I started the newsletter right before I bailed on Twitter so that I could drag over as many of the people who were actually paying attention to anything I ever said on social media. But I feel like, you know, like I had close to 100,000 Twitter followers, but I never had more than a couple thousand people ever read a tweet. Usually it would be like a couple hundred people or a couple dozen people. Whereas the newsletter, like, I think it's like 8,000 people read it whenever I send it out. And I'm not like one of those guys who does it every week on a schedule or anything like that. I do it, you know, usually when there's something cool I want to show people, or I've written something about process that I want to talk about. I enjoy that part of it a lot. That's where I've been putting up the like my comic memories history stuff is in my newsletter. I want to interview people in it, like just do like 5 questions kind of things with people. But newsletters are fucking exhausting. They take all day to put together. If you start putting it together ahead of time, you'll find you can spend 3 or 4 days putting together something, and you're just like, holy shit, I spent so long on this that, you know, how many people are going to see it in their inbox and just be like, oh, another newsletter, like, because everyone has one now. But yeah, I use it a lot to like preview stuff for our readership, and you know, let people know when like final order cutoff is, or what stores might have like signed book plates, because we do a bunch of, we probably at this point we're probably signing book plates for like 20% of the print run that we put out of these Reckless books, because more and more stores just want the signed book plates they can stick inside, which is great. But it takes forever to sign them.
Cartoonist Kayfabe is brought to you by the comic books that we make. Jim Rugg and Ed Piskor are lifelong cartoonists with a heck of a bibliography, and March is Cartoonist Kayfabe month at the comic shops. Jim Rugg is going to be presenting you Hulk Grand Design Monster at the end of March, and Ed Piskor is going to be bringing you Red Room Trigger Warnings issue number 1 on March 9th. High Octane Incredible Hulk comics, distilling down the history of the Incredible Hulk into 2 solid 40-page comics coming month after month. This will be coming out in April. Incredible Hulk Grand Design Madness. These are the variant covers to go along with Hulk Grand Design. The first run, the Ed Piskor, the Marcos Martin, the Peach Momoko. Got this Jeff Darrow cover that's going to come with the second issue. And Jim, you've yet to print me up the Ed McGuinness variant cover that's coming up with that next one.
Coming soon.
Red Room Trigger Warnings, Murder on the Dark Web for Fun and Profit. First issue coming out, like I said, March 9th. And these are the additional covers to go along with that. The Jim Rugg by way of Robert Crumb, Peach Momoko, and the Eddie P variant. Going to be coming out on a monthly basis, completely self-contained. And Rising Tide Raises All Ships, and we have other books in print at the moment. The rest of Jim's bibliography that you could get on Amazon or at a good comic shop today. Plain Jane's, Street Angel, Deadliest Girl Alive, collecting all of his Image Comics versions of Street Angel. We have new printings of Hip Hop Family Tree that are out in the wild, the box sets and individual issues, so they are no longer $200 on eBay and Amazon anymore. WYSIWYG, still in print. Portrait of a Serial Hacker, get your hands on that. And the Grand Design that started them all, X-Men Grand Design, 3 volumes of that you can get easily at any good comic shop or on Amazon. And there is also an omnibus that is out of print, but you might be able to find it in the wild here and there. Was out at the flea market recently, saw a copy. Now that we're done paying the bills, let's get back to the video.
Your books have a really distinct look. Like, I think they look really great, you know, on the shelf, the cover design. They look amazing. Typography.
I was going to say, I mean, I buy all your, I love that you've switched to graphic albums for all the Street Angel stuff. And like, I look at that stuff a lot, like design of all those books. Sean does all ours, but I'll send him examples of stuff that I like a lot.
That's cool. That's what I was going to ask, if you guys, you know, work with a third party or how you figure that out, because obviously you have a visual background.
Yeah, I do. But covers was always my worst. I'm like a storyteller. Like, I kept a notebook instead of a sketchbook as a kid. Like, I would write the stories that I always think in panels and pages. So covers are always the hardest part for me. At some point, I was talking to a guy who's like an editor at one of the Amazon publishing lines, actually. This is like 10 years ago or so. And he said every cover should be designed at, like, to be viewed at 2 inches tall. Because he said also the cover is the most important piece of advertising for your book, whether you realize it or not. It's like you have about 1 second to 2 seconds to grab someone's attention with your cover. So, I mean, that's the joy of only doing graphic novels now, is we can spend more time on the design of the covers than we could on every single month during, you know, monthly comics. But yeah, Sean and I will go back and forth on some of our graphic novel covers a lot. A lot of times it'll be like, he'll send a sketch and I'll be like, oh, that's perfect. Like with Pulp, I gave him a couple of ideas for a way to, I was like, maybe on one side, he's like, we see him on the horse, and on the other side, he's like, you know, the old man or whatever. And he drew it both as the Western. But the second I saw it, I was like, oh, this is perfect. Whereas my heroes have always been junkies. We went through, God, we must have spent a week arguing about the design of that cover, because Sean really didn't just want to do the close-up of her with the cigarette with the text partly covering her. And I was like, I just kept insisting. I was like, no, I really think I'm right about this. And eventually, like, our wives got in on it, and we were each getting our wives' opinion, and his wife and my wife both agreed with my vision on it. And I was like, victory. But we'll go back and forth on, like, Bad Weekend, the one we did about the old cartoonist going to Comic-Con. Like, we went through, I think in the last Criminal collection, there's like all the different colored schemes that we went through before we decided on the pink one. And which was hilarious, because the pink one was like the second one Sean sent over. And then we spent days. So we really think about that stuff a lot. And Sean's super particular. We actually force, in our foreign publishing contracts, we force them to follow our designs and covers a lot of the time. Like, we'll have it put in our contract that we have cover approval of everything. And sometimes they'll just do a new logo, and you're like, yeah, no, just put our fucking logo there. That's what we want it to look like. So yeah, we're super. The great thing about me and Sean as a team is Sean's super fast. Like, he's one of the he's one of the fastest artists I've ever worked with. But he's also got a degree in design and looks at that stuff a lot. He'll go look at like comps, like, you know, magazine covers and logos and all sorts of stuff to try to like spark ideas for what he wants our next books to look like. I look at a lot of old paperback covers from like the 50s and 60s all the time, trying to find like really unique designs that we can steal. I mean, do an homage too.
Right.
But yeah, we're like as obsessive with the packaging as we are with the comics, which, you know, that's the great thing about independent comics right now for us is like, especially Image, like we choose the paper, we choose where it's being printed. We, you know, we do everything from, and we send them a print ready book basically. And, you know, and make sure I know exactly how everything's going to be. It's been a long time since I've had something show up where I'm like, what the fuck? This isn't the right paper, you know, or who wanted this on shiny stock? Matte finish, you know, like, so yeah, we spend a lot of time on that. And, you know, Jim, again, I think this is one of the things we share, like all of us, I think, have like an obsessive design sense to everything we put out. But your guys' work both really leaps out at me off the shelves as having, it's that weird mix of both nostalgia and the new at the same time. You know, I always find that very exciting, and it's such a comic book thing, you know.
It's neat as we've been talking to more, you know, people like you. Brian K. Vaughan comes to mind. These guys who I think of as high profile comic creators, but you're doing this work at like an Image where you're doing what I think of as a great strength of comics is it's one or two people's vision,
Yeah.
you know, compared to film or other media or any other
Yeah.
projects. And to extend that to production and design, it's really remarkable. And I don't know that I've heard that conversation a lot, but it's almost extending what makes comics great now into like the book design, publication of those comics.
And so much of the market too is about those deluxe hardbacks. Like people really, like we have a whole part of our audience that isn't buying anything we're doing right now because they're waiting for the deluxe hardback that's like an inch taller. like that's what my all those we reprinted the first two Criminal deluxe editions last year, right after we put out the third one. And I could not believe, I didn't know how much the original ones were selling for because they'd been out of print for like 8 or 10 years. But yeah, when I saw like you know, I was worried we were printing too many, and I think we basically sold out of them in like a month. And I was like, holy shit, we didn't print nearly enough. But yeah, it's like, I love the idea of creating like a art book, and like the artifact itself is so important to me. And I'm always having to explain to foreign publishers when they want to get the rights to publish our stuff, but also do the deluxe versions. I'm like, you're not allowed to publish the deluxe version digitally. And they're like, why not? And I'm like, because you can't have an oversized art book in a digital. It's like, what, are you only going to have it on the large iPad? You know, like it's just like it's an art object. Like you can only print it physically. You can't sell, like you can sell the comic book size ones digitally. I don't care. You know, like I hate digital comics really. I read, you know, I read the odd like online ones, but I don't have a Comixology. I guess they ended that anyway, but I don't have memberships to any of that stuff. And I read PDFs from friends when they send me things on advance, and I feel like I spend enough time looking at a screen. I want to sit down with like pieces of paper and, you know, stuff that help destroy the environment in a different way.
What about do you work with an editor or who do you show, like whenever you're working on a new project or a new script? Do you have somebody that you pass that by?
Not in such a way where I want like someone to tell me whether or not to do something. We have a couple times listed someone as an editor where it's more like they're sort of doing the editing the way Marvel and DC editors do, where it's more like traffic management. Like when I was on Westworld, the like hours were just so insane that I couldn't keep track of everything that needed to happen to make sure our books got to print on time. I was getting up at like 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. and writing a couple pages of comics and then going to an office for like 9 or 12 hours a day. So I brought on somebody to handle that stuff, but I never really, I feel like because Sean is so fast, when I'm writing my scripts, I write every scene to the point where like I've rewritten it. By the time I'm sending him a chapter of like one of our books, I've probably written 5 drafts of it. Like just because when I sit down in the morning, I'll go back to the whatever the first page of that chapter is and start from there. So I'm kind of tightening as I go and rewriting as I go. And even with Marvel and DC, I almost never had an editor be like, oh, you should change this or that and this will be way better. Like, I just feel like, coming from indie comics and stuff, and especially working in TV and film, you get so many different people telling you why a scene isn't working, or you need to change it to this or that, and really you're just making things different. So I like that, it's just me and it's Sean. If I'm in the early formative stages of an idea and I'm not sure about it, like I have like a group of friends that we have like a Slack thing that we're on, like posting our work to share with each other and stuff as we're creating it. And, I'll talk about like, I have this weird idea for a book. And like one of my favorite things that Sean and I ever did actually came from me bouncing a crazy idea off of this small group of, other writers and artists. One of our criminal stories, The Last of the Innocent, that's sort of like what happens when Archie grows up story. That was a thing I thought, I was like, am I crazy or is this a good idea? And will anyone besides me be interested in it? And they were all like, those are the ideas that are always the most cool, is the ones you think no one's going to give a shit about. And so a lot of what I've done in the last 5 or 10 years has been influenced by, bouncing these ideas around. I think all of us do it with each other and sort of show our work in stages, like Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky and, a few other, I probably shouldn't be naming people. We don't talk shit about anybody ever, I swear. But yeah, just like friends that I've had for years, and we just, we sort of are in constant communication on and off throughout the day. And if you get like a great cover or a sketch or something that you want to show, you should post it up there. And, so a lot of it is that. I wouldn't consider that like an editor really. I don't know. It's a weird one because I do feel like editors do serve a purpose, like a good editor. And when in film and TV, I definitely want to get feedback from, like, if I'm writing an outline for a movie, before I actually start writing the script, I want to show it to like 3 or 4 different screenwriter friends and get their feedback on like, does this flowing right? Does this feel like a movie? But it's like people who I respect and who I know are already good at what they're doing, as opposed to just some random executive where I'm like, your job is to say no to things. Your job is to be afraid of getting fired if you say yes to the wrong thing. So like, what have you ever written? It's like Martin McDonagh, like when he wrote In Bruges, his agent, he sent it to his agent and his agent said, what do you want me to do with it? And he's like, send it around, I want to direct it, and he's like, well, do you have any demands? He's like, yeah, I would like no notes. and he's like, so whoever, is willing to put up the money and not give me notes on the script can have it. and I think he was being interviewed by like Elvis Mitchell, and he was like, so you don't like studio notes? And he's like, my feeling with notes is, what the fuck have you ever written? Which is funny because like I would love to have Martin McDonagh read one of my things and be like, you should change this or this or this, or have you thought about this? Even if I'm going to disagree, it's like, it's nice to get someone else's feedback sometimes. Or if I'm stuck on a story, especially crime stories, a lot of my non-comics friends are like professional crime writers or journalists and stuff. So I'll call up one of them and I'll be like, hey, can I talk you through this point in this book where I'm at, where I'm not 100% sure whether to go left or right. And then I'll stand in my front yard on my phone and talk to like Sarah Grand for an hour, or Dwayne Swarzynski or Greg Rucka or one of these people, and just sort of, usually it ends up being that the thing I wanted to do is the thing I should have just done, but I was second guessing myself because I was 80% through a graphic novel. And you have that moment where you wake up in fear of like, holy shit, what if I went off track 40 pages ago and it's all drawn? Like, this is a nightmare.
It's so common. We were just going through the Eisner Miller book a little bit. And both of actually it was Frank Miller, when he was working on that family values graphic novel, Sin City. where it was really like the first time he really didn't have the tether of an editor looking over his shoulders while he's working on it, and he's talking about like at a certain point he doesn't even know if it's comprehensible or not. And Eisner sort of concurred that there's just like this moment during the process where it's like who knows, man? Like
you're so far in the forest that I find that with film especially, because it's such a, like with the comics, even the graphic novels Sean and I are doing, like I will send him 10 or 15 pages at a time, and as I'm writing the next pages I'm seeing pages come in, so it's like almost this moment of like anxiety but also relief of like, okay, this worked. And also it's fucking committed to paper. I can change the text, but he's not going to redraw all these pages. Like that's fucking insane. So it is that moment though of like, so far every single book I've had like this moment of anxiety of like, oh God, did I leave myself enough room to finish the book? Am I going to have to call up Sean and go, hey, can you draw 15 more pages before our deadline? And I found out with the first, My Heroes Have Always Been Junkies was our first time doing an original hardback. And we put out hardbacks before, and that they were reprints of stuff. And I hadn't really thought about the schedule. It takes the distributor and the printer a month longer to do a hardback book than it does to turn around a paperback or a single issue comic. And so suddenly, that was why Jake, Sean's son, became our full-time colorist. Was Sean was actually going to color Junkies himself, and Jake was going to like assist him because Jake was just like fresh out of art school. And Sean colored the first 2 pages to sort of show Jake what he wanted. And then suddenly we found out that our deadline was like 6 weeks earlier than it was. And so I was like, hey, Jake, you're coloring the book. And I don't think we had very many notes for him even. Like it was, which I thought was like one of the most, definitely the boldest debut of a colorist in comics ever. Like he doesn't color within the lines. He's doing experimental shit on every page. And now Jake, of course, draws a bunch of his own comics that he does all the art and lettering and coloring. And he's like his dad plus colors. Barely touched the surface.
Yeah, there's a lot, and we're not going to get to all of it. We were talking about kind of the personal part of comics and how that's a strength, and I think that you get into it even in distribution with things like the Panel Syndicate Friday series.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you think about that, but it's I love that that's available to us as creators now. Like we might not have 25 distributors as they had in the 80s, but we do have these other avenues, and it's cool to see you exploring that.
Yeah, it was interesting. Have you guys talked to the Substack guys at all?
No.
Oh, you should talk to them. It's interesting what they're doing, and they're throwing a shit ton of money around, which is the even more interesting part.
What was their phone number?
I'll get you Nick's email. But I mean, I think you guys would do amazing on something like that. I know he's been talking to Jaime, trying to get Jaime, and I'm probably not allowed to say any of this, but no one's going to see this. But they're, they want to have lots of. Well, I think Adrian's doing something for them, actually, Tomina. But yeah, there all these different avenues. Kickstarter to me was like a big breakthrough when I saw like Mike Kaluta and them like doing a revamped or a remastered version of Starstruck on Kickstarter, and I was like, oh, I'm going to invest. And that was like my first Kickstarter thing I ever jumped into, I think. And now, of course, they're like doing all this NFT blockchain bullshit, which I don't understand or care about, or I just know the right people seem to be upset about it, so fuck them, I guess. But that was, to me, was kind of mind-blowing to see some of these, like, especially like the older guys like Starlin and these guys who are able to keep doing their comics by just selling to their core audience and making more money than if they'd have done it through Marvel or DC or, like that kind of avenue is really interesting to me. And like Panel Syndicate, Marcos just thinks digital comics should be whatever people want to spend. And, I think on the average, he makes a little bit more than he would have made if he'd been paid a page rate and published it through like a major publisher. And, but at the same time, if like a Friday TV show happens, all the money goes directly to, anybody who wants to read it all digitally has to get it at Panel Syndicate. And, it's interesting to me is that like it's about half people who pay and half people who don't pay, but the people who pay like overpay, like almost all of them. Some of them will pay like $20, and I'm like, holy shit. But yeah, I thought that was a really interesting platform. It's weird, the Comixology thing, like blending with Amazon now, and now it's just Kindle only, because every now and then when I'm trying to read something that I can't find a copy of, I'll buy like the Kindle version of it just to read it. And it's such a counterintuitive way to read comics. The double page spreads are like a fucking postage stamp for some reason. So it's interesting that digital comics has been like 15 years now, and so few people have actually like we're still drawing comics and making comics for print, really. You know, like almost everything about comics that we love is still for the print version. Like I know some producers who love to read comics on their phone in panel view, and I'm like, I don't know anybody who would want to just look at a comic panel by panel. Like I like to think of the page. Like I'm a comic book snob, I guess.
It's interesting you say that, because like as we look at like old interviews, sometimes it'll come up with creators that it wasn't common to think page layout. It was like almost panel to panel in some instances. You know, like I think that becomes more of a topic of conversation at some point, maybe in the 70s or so. But the flip side is something like webtoons, where it's like there is no page. It was always created, at least with the scroll or the phone screen in mind, you know, which is about
that trips me out.
Yeah, it's different.
There's some huge selling fantasy one that just came out. It's like some porn, some like softcore porny fantasy thing, and but yeah, like they had to figure out how to break it into pages to print it.
Yeah.
To sell like 500,000 copies or something of a comic I've never heard of before. but yeah, that's an interesting one. That scroll of it. I remember when Scott McCloud first did something like that to sort of show the potential of comics for the web, and I was like, well, this is kind of a mind fuck. Like, it's amazing to me that Chris Ware hasn't gotten obsessed with it, but I guess the old-fashioned old man inside of him is like, yeah, I still use the same ink jar for my pens.
That's right. He did a couple weird things. Like there was some like pressure sensitive like iPad thing.
Yeah, he's definitely done
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd be one of those guys who, you know, you could see doing like a choose your own adventure kind of thing almost. But because how weird would it be to be able to just like click on a Chris Ware panel and have a whole other page open up that has the flashback story that the guy's thinking. It's like that kind of stuff about the digital stuff I think is kind of amazing, but I'm such a print person. I'm Generation X. I'm gonna die on the print hill with the rest of the world.
Well, I mean, it's noteworthy too. I think it looks better now. What you can do in print now is better than it's ever been as well. You know, you talk about speccing your own paper. I mean, think about the colors that we get. You know, like it's you can do better print now, I think, than basically any other time. So
did you ever work in like print in the 90s, like where you had to have ruby lith overlays and stuff? And like the first comics I did through DC, we got the color proofs were like watercolored Xeroxes with all the lines telling you like what gradient everything was supposed to, and I was like, holy shit, like that whole side of it is gone. Now we're looking at colors almost exactly like what they're going to be on the page. Like some things will darken up more than others, and some things won't print as dark as you want them to. But for the most part, like, you know, like I spend like Sean sends me pages, you know, every week I get a batch of pages from Sean. And when our books are getting ready for print, I spend like a month and a half getting batches of pages from Jake in color. And it pretty much looks like what the book is. And, you know, and yeah, the paper quality now is insane. The price has fucking gone up, of course, because of pandemic shit, you know, but yeah, it's like, that's the other thing about comics people, like especially I guess guys like us, where we actually care about like what the you know, can you make the background of the paper look like it's faded newsprint? And you know, like I love getting obsessive about all that stuff. And when sometimes a book will come out from Fantagraphics and I'll like email Eric Reynolds to find out what the paper is. Like what kind of paper is this? where did you print it? What was your unit cost? Like I think about all that stuff all the time because I'm just like, I just care about the objects themselves so much as, like,
If you're
I feel
going to
like,
cut the tree down and make the object, that's what I want. I want the person to
yeah,
care about it. Like, make it mean something. Make it, the best book that you can make. It's the ones that
yeah,
look like no thought went into it that's the crime against nature.
yeah, that's totally true. Yeah. And it is like, it's funny because we grew up when comics were thought of as a disposable medium. And now I'm like, I want everything I do to be like the opposite of disposable. Like I get mad when I see one of my books in a used bookstore. I used to be like happy about it. And then I was like, man, someone didn't want to keep this.
It's a personal affront.
Yeah, it's like it's like when I was on social media, you only care about the complainers. You never care about all the people who are like heaping praise on whatever you did. You're
Right.
like, yeah, you missed all the bad parts.
Negativity bias.
Yeah, exactly.
Ed, do you think about writing prose?
I have. I mean, I started out when I was in Seattle doing like the low life comics. I was working at the Stranger doing like movie reviews and the occasional like longer piece, just sort of, I don't know how to even describe it. Just kind of like, here's what this experience was like reviewing life. But I've tried a couple times to write like crime novels, and I've never been able to give myself enough of a window to actually do it between the comics deadlines. Like what the great thing about me and Sean is that, like, I think the reason we're so prolific is because Sean always wants pages to draw. Like he feels something's wrong in life if he's going a week without drawing. And so I like this constant need to make decisions when I'm stuck on a story and keep him fed with pages has really been, a huge part of the last like couple decades of my life. And so I feel like to write a novel, you pretty much have to only be doing that. Like every morning you get up and you spend like 4 hours writing your novel and then whatever else you're going to do with your day. And I think I put that kind of effort into the books that I'm doing with Sean, basically, and now with Marcos, and like I just don't know. Like sometimes I think, oh, I've got to at least write one like crime novel before I die, and but then I start thinking about it. I'm like, oh, I could turn it into a graphic novel, and so I think that it's like, it's an interesting thing. We didn't get to it, but it's like at some point I switched from writing and drawing my own comics to I was writing and drawing my own comics, but also writing things for other people at the same time. And then once I started working with like Michael and Sean, I pretty much phased out of drawing my own comics. And I think part of it was like the creative satisfaction of seeing like Michael Lark and Sean Phillips and Darwin Cook like turn in stuff that I'd written, and it looked so much better than anything I could have possibly drawn. Like I always had ideas for like, I guess graphic novels was what we were calling them at the time, and now everybody calls them that. Like I remember in the 90s I was part of this group in Seattle that was like Jason Lutz, Tom Hart, John Lewis, Megan Kelso, James Sturm. And we had like every Tuesday we would get together and show each other like what we were working on and give each other feedback and stuff. And I got a lot out of that, but I always felt like those guys were so much better at what they were doing than I was, like artistically. And at some point, like I remember I was trying to work on an idea for a crime thing, and I just realized like it's gonna look like an Archie comic, but with crime in it. Like it's not gonna be what I want it to be because I can't draw like David Mazzucchelli or Alex Toth. Like I just don't have that ability. And so working with other artists like suddenly started to satisfy that creative urge and like open up these other, doors in my brain of like, oh, I could write a story about this, or I could write that. And, I would say for sure the last 10, 15 years, everything I've written that Sean has drawn has been, you know, as personally important to me as like the stuff that I used to write and draw for myself. Whereas, you know, like when you're writing Batman and stuff like that, you don't put as much of yourself into it. In some ways, you're trying to like, you know, write for the character as opposed to shoving your own feelings into it. But when I write criminal, it's like all those characters are like me and my friends, and a lot of those things are at least loosely based on things that really happened. And you know, the Reckless books are all just me sort of trying to relive moments of the 80s and try to remember when the world felt like it was going to end but it didn't, you know. So I find like a lot of creative satisfaction in doing these books with other artists who, you know, every now and then I think, oh, I never imagined I'd be one of those guys who quit doing comics. That I had a lot of friends who'd be like, I'm giving up comics, I can't do it anymore. And I always was just like, how could you give up comics? It's like saying you're giving up having a disease or something. Like you don't get to choose that. Comics is like, if you're a comics person, like you just sort of at some point in your life you found that you were reading comics all the time and you were drawing comics and you never thought about it. Like everybody I know who's a comics person has the same origin story. If the odd people who are like, you know, I was in college and I read Watchmen, and I'm like, that's super weird to me. Like to me, it's like, no, you weren't tracing fucking peanuts in the newspaper strip when you were 4. Like that to me feels like the origin of most of my generation of comics people.
You do find those odd ones that can like punch the clock, like get up for work, you know, draw a page or whatever, clock out for the day at 4 p.m. and then just become a regular citizen. But I don't know those people. I just know that they're out there. You know, like going to conventions, you talk to a couple of those guys here and there.
Yeah, apparently Seth like keeps a regular schedule, which for how I guess he's really productive on stuff that we don't see, like building a tiny city in his basement or something. But I remember watching part of that documentary about him and he was like, I like routine. And I'm like, that is kind of a cool thing about comics. I remember Seth was one of the people who, when I was young, that I knew a little bit through like Chester and Joe Matt. And that he said something to me that just was like mind blowing, where he was showing Doug Wright art. And he talked about how Doug Wright had worked for this magazine for like 30 years. And he was like, could you imagine like the joy of sitting down and just being able to do this every week for 30 years in like this huge magazine? Like, and I thought about it. I think about that all the time now when I look back, whenever I'm frustrated about some part of publishing or one of our books didn't get covered somewhere that I was told it was going to, or whatever. I'm like, I've spent the last 20 years like with Sean pretty much, especially the last 15, just doing whatever the fuck we wanted and been like really successful at it. But because I'm a comics person, I can only see like the downside. Sometimes I have to stop and remind myself like how fucking lucky I am. And, you know, like all of us, like you meet people at conventions all the time who are like, you know, like telling you how much your stuff inspires them or wanting advice, or like so many people in line at that convention like want to be on the other side of the table. You know, I did when I was growing up. I would like seek out these guys who I loved, like Jaime and Gilbert, and tag along with them and try to get art tips. And, you know, like it's just such an interesting field. But yeah, it's because it's comics, we always feel like, you know, even though comics is the biggest thing in pop culture right now, like Marvel and DC and all that shit, like own pop culture, like comics still has this sort of like a downtrodden stepchild kind of thing to it. Like we always feel like we're a little bit overlooked. And, you know, you do feel that too when you're like the comics people invited to the movie premiere and you're like, oh, we're in the overflow theater. Okay. Even the people who are making billions of dollars on the stuff we do don't really appreciate the comics people. So comics always feel unappreciated, but it's like, it's kind of amazing. Like I got to do a book about an old unappreciated cartoonist. Like I would have never imagined that 20 years ago when I was trying to like pitch ideas to people. It's like now I don't have to pitch ideas to people. I just do whatever the fuck I want. And, you know, if I want to write a really boring thing about an old man going to Comic-Con, like I can do that.
We do have that opportunity, and it's sort of up to us as creators to, like, if Japan has this expanded kind of landscape of comics readers, well, who's going to be the one to make the great baseball comic? Who's going to be the one to
Yeah.
make something about people who hang out in, I was going to say arcades, but I don't think that
Yeah.
exists anymore. But you get
Yeah.
the picture, man.
I look at the market as it exists today, especially for alternative comics. And this is like in the 80s and early 90s, this is exactly what we wished it would be. Like huge graphic novel. Like I have no idea how much Tilly Walden or Emily Carroll sell, but I'm assuming it's a fuck ton because their books are great and you hear about them all the time. And I'm like, like we couldn't have dreamed of that. It was such a big deal whenever someone got like a book released from Pantheon or something that was a collection of their weekly newspaper strip or something. It was like, oh my God, you're from a real book publisher. Now it's like, not only is that a thing, but like all the major comic publishers have book distribution deals, and like Walking Dead is the most successful thing in the history of comic books for the creators. like it's not only one of the most successful things in the history of comics ever, just based on how much it sold even before the TV show, but like the creators got all of it. Depending on the lawsuits.
A little bit for the lawyers.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, it's crazy to me that even stuff from Image, is selling hundreds of thousands. Like Saga must sell hundreds of thousands through the bookstore market, and then probably like 50, 100,000 through the comics market. And like that's insane. Like me and Sean now sell like half our books to the book market and half to comic stores now that we're doing graphic novels. And before we were graphic novel only, we were probably like 30% bookstores and 70% comic stores.
You guys are definitely very well represented at the Barnes and Nobles here in Pittsburgh.
Oh, that's good. The thing that's been interesting, you see it throughout the entertainment industry. Like when I first started coming to LA to be, to take meetings about like, oh, we want to take one of your books and turn it into a movie, or hire me for a screenwriting job or whatever. Like most of the people that you'd be meeting with didn't know anything about comics or who you were. It was their assistant who was like their job. Like you'd go in and there's an assistant with like a stack of comics this high on their desk, and all those assistants now are like running the studios and the nerds like slowly took over. And it's like I always say the best friend you can make in the direct market especially is like get the guys who work at the counter, like in your book. When I was working at Comic Relief in Berkeley, like when I first started there, 8-Ball came out, and I think they'd only sold like 30 or 40 copies of the first issue. And when issue 2 came out, I like convinced them to order like hundreds of copies. And I was like at the front counter on New Comics Day, and I just made everyone buy it. And I was like, look, if you don't like it, money back guarantee. And no one brought it back. And it was like, if you get the comic book bartenders to be your fans of what you do, then you can survive in this market. I mean, it's hard as fuck to make a living in comics. Everyone who does is incredibly lucky, but you can, like that slow trickle up of the nerds taking over. Like now, a lot of the store owners are those guys who used to, run the register. So it's fun to see all of that stuff. And thank God that there was never like a Barnes and Noble for comics or something that would have driven all of them. Comics is such a weird, fucked up small business that, like, because I was working at a bookstore when Borders and Barnes and Noble took over the world, and all these bookstores just went out of business. And now they're building back because Barnes and Noble and Borders and all those things went bankrupt. I think Barnes and Noble is owned by someone else now, like some British company.
I think that's one of the strengths of comic books. When we say comic book stores, it's like really it's couple of thousand little entrepreneurs who all run their businesses. Kind of unique to how they figure. It's a bunch of smart people that run these things individually. And, from a survival standpoint, that's actually a brilliant strategy. Like you think of like how life works, like that's actually a good thing.
Take care of you. Like
each store is dependent on what the owner, even like a chain of stores, like that has like 8 or 9 stores, they're all dependent on the owners and managers and their tastes. And, what they think comics should be. Like there's 25, or so really, really big stores that when you go in, you're just like, holy shit, these guys do it right. And then you're like, if you really add it up, you're like, oh, there's like $10 million worth of books on the shelves in here. So, not every store can do that. But yeah, my whole life growing up, you go to comic stores and it was just hit or miss what you were going to get. It was like you could walk into this hole in the wall where there's like a guy eating a burrito behind the counter and just stacks of back issues everywhere and no lighting, or you could walk into Comic Relief where you're just like, holy shit, this is like fucking Mecca. They have everything. So yeah, it is a weird thing. But yeah, I think the fact that nobody ever sort of drove them out of business with the chain stores, and everyone who owns a comic store just really loves comics and wants to do that. But now in the bookstore markets too, like all those indie bookstores have graphic novel sections, and 10 years ago, whoever was in charge of that graphic novel section didn't know anything about comics. They just ordered whatever the reps told them. Now you go into like there's a bunch of bookstore like Skylight Books in LA. Like if you go in there, like their graphic novel section is huge, and the guy who curates it knows what the fuck he's talking about. There's a bunch of stores now that like once you get someone who knows what it's like. I have a bunch of stores telling me The Fade Out is still one of their top selling graphic novels, like in the bookstores. Like if they put it on their list every Christmas as like one of the graphic novels to buy, and they sell hundreds of them. And I'm like, holy shit, no wonder that book keeps moving, because we're not talking about it. We're not pushing it. Like I keep having to take it back to print, and I'm like, it's just like a mainstream looking graphic novel that Zadie Smith said something nice about. So,
10th year anniversary edition coming up in a couple
of years.
Yeah.
Oh, that's probably true. A good reason to bring the hardback back.
Well, I think we're up on like about the 35th anniversary of Pajama Chronicles or something. So,
oh my God, I can't believe you went that deep.
so
I was waiting.
We need to go on the hunt for extra copies of that, man, to get slabbed from
CCC. Cover colored with pop rocks or something. That was in the days of blue lines for your covers, actually. Ooh, yeah, that one you didn't there's nothing online about my issue of Gumby 3D, is there?
Was that a Blackthorn as well, or a Kamiko?
Yeah, when I was working at Comic Kingdom, my friend and I got asked to draw a story for Gumby 3D. That was like my first professional gig, because the guy who was drawing the comic was behind schedule. And he gave us printouts from the episode of the cartoon we were adapting that, like, back in the mid 80s, they were like this really slick, gross paper. He'd like freeze framed the whole episode and printed out like 1,000 like things. And we had no concept of deadlines. I remember he came in like 3 months later screaming at us because we'd been so late on the deadline for this 12-page Gumby thing.
The Gumby Renaissance of the 80s, man. I was there.
Yeah.
Art Clokey represent.
Yeah, the Gumby Renaissance. It was Art Adams, I guess, right?
Yeah.
He brought Gumby back.
and Eddie Murphy.
Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's hilarious.
Jim,
you know what? I'll be real fast, and this is all I've got. I always think of you with Charles Willeford and like his Hope Mosley books. Is that something that's on your radar? Is that a writer?
Yeah, I love Willeford. I've read a couple of those books for sure. I mean, he's one of the all-time greats. There's a great movie called The Woman Chaser that's based on one of his. It's like the movie is only 72 minutes long or something like that, and it's shot in 16 millimeter in black and white. But it's about a used car salesman who decides to become a filmmaker, but he refuses to compromise ever. It's amazing. It's from like the late 90s. It's by that guy who did the documentary about the people who are obsessed with fucking horses.
Oh yeah, I know that documentary.
Of course. Yeah.
That makes sense.
But yeah, no, I love Willeford. Yeah, I'm like a classic noir kind of guy. I've been rereading a bunch of like Elmore Leonard, or reading a bunch of Elmore Leonard books that I'd never actually read before that were super popular in the 70s and 80s. I read like the later Elmore Leonard stuff. but yeah, I go through phases where I don't read anything but like nonfiction, because it's more inspiring in some ways, or you just need to for research, which I always think is one of those things that no one ever talks about with, comic book writing or comic book drawing, is the amount of research that people should actually be doing. And, in TV too, it's like, you hear all these comments about like, oh, so and so shouldn't write this story or shouldn't write that story. And I'm like, so and so should just research before they write the thing. Maybe they should research what life was like for, women in Hollywood in the 40s before they write a story about it. But yeah, so I read a lot of nonfiction, but yeah, especially during the pandemic, I've just been reading, I think I must have caught up on like 10 years of Michael Connelly novels. And there's a guy who publishes a lot of books. Often they feel like the exact same book, but I kind of feel like that's part of the comfort of it.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And my last thing, and this is my big fanboy moment here. I love Claire DeWitt, and I hear that you're friends with Sarah Gran. If it's not too personal, how did you guys meet?
I was friends with Megan Abbott. I met Megan Abbott at like the Los Angeles Times Book Fair. We were sitting next to each other, and I was a big fan. And I gave her a couple of my books and my email. I think I gave her like the first 3 criminal books and my email. And then like she emailed me like a couple weeks later, and we just kept in touch through email and texting and stuff, and would bounce ideas for crime stories off each other. And Sarah and Megan had like a blog that they were doing, and I wrote a thing about the Great Brain and Encyclopedia Brown for that, and which I think I reprinted in like as an extra in a criminal thing, or one of the backs of one of our issues. But it was about Encyclopedia Brown stealing the Wayback Machine and going back and having a contest with the Great Brain. But Sarah was working in LA on Southland, the TV show for TNT. I saw her name on one of the episodes, and I just wrote to Megan and I said, "Hey, does your friend Sarah live here?" And she said, "Yeah, I'll hook you guys up." And me and her and my wife like went out for coffee one night and just hit it off. And she's one of the people who I call up to ask for advice about stuff. But she's actually, I think she's my wife's best friend at this point, probably. I talk to her all the time. Yeah, she's fantastic. Her new book is really amazing. It's called The Book of the Most Precious Substance. And it's basically like, it's got the same tone as a Claire DeWitt book, but it's sort of like if the Da Vinci Code were about fucking. It's like her version of like an erotic thriller. And she started her own publishing company to do it. And it's been like a pretty big hit for her, I think, actually. But yeah, I love those Claire DeWitt books, are just the greatest. She did this, I'll try and find a copy of it and email it to you. She did a choose your own adventure thing a couple of years ago that she sent me a PDF for. And it's great because you want to choose your own thing, but then you go through and you read the whole thing, and it all works as a short story too. But yeah, she's just one of those amazing like creative people, and she does a lot of work for TV and film, some of it that we don't see and some of it that we do. Her and David Slade, this other friend of ours, made a pilot last year with like Susan Sarandon, and Kristen Glover was in it. But it sounded like it was amazing. It was for HBO Max, but they didn't go through with it for some reason. But it was like a all in one location murder mystery thing. But she sold it pre Knives Out being a thing. But it was called Mockingbird Lane, and it was all about this, murder that happened in this house. And it was going to be really cool, but it didn't go forward. But yeah, she does a fair amount of like TV and film writing. So we get together and grouse about that. We used to go to the used bookstore together and then have lunch and grouse about writing and TV and stuff, and who we hated and who we loved.
Well, I enjoy her prose voice. It certainly seems like kind of unique. Whenever I came across that, it stood out. So it's very cool.
Yeah, her and my friend Charles Yu, who he won the National Book Award last year for Interior Chinatown, his weird experimental prose novel. But her and Charlie are my two friends who every time I read anything they write, I want to murder them because they put words in the exact right order and it seems effortless. And like I try really hard to make my work look effortless because it never is. Like I was up from 5:30 until right before we started this, and I got like 2 pages done.
Wow.
So
That's one of the great lessons from the people that we interview. Like always talking to people at the top of their game, and it never comes easy. There's never like a cruise control. It seems.
oh no, yeah, I remember. You guys know Steve Weissman?
Yeah.
Okay, so Steve and I, before I moved back, I was living in San Francisco. I would spend the '90s sort of bopping back and forth between San Francisco and Seattle. And when I was leaving San Francisco, the last time that I moved back to Seattle from there, I guess not the last time. Well, one of the times in the '90s, we decided we were going to do the Schultz pilgrimage, and we got up. This was like '97, I want to say, and we got up and one of my roommates came with us and my girlfriend at the time, and we got up at like 5 a.m. and drove up to Santa Rosa to go to the Warm Puppy Diner at the Empire skating rink or whatever. And my roommate went because she wanted to do ice skating, and she found out that up until it was closed in the mornings for like professional ice skating practice because he built the thing for his daughter who was like an Olympic skater. And Steve and I are sitting there with, I've got my copy of More Peanuts, the first edition like copy that I still have. And Steve has like, one of his like Peanuts digests that we spent the '90s like in used bookstores tracking down all the Peanuts digests before Fantagraphics started reprinting all of them. Seth used to actually send out zines of the uncollected Peanuts every year. That was like his Christmas present, was he would spend half his time in the library finding the unreprinted Peanuts strips where it's like Charlotte Braun is in it and
Oh yeah,
stuff.
man. So you prefer Braun, not Brown.
Yeah. No, I'm a big Charlotte Braun fan. But we went up and made the because it's like Schultz, no matter if you're a cartoonist, even if you've never tried to do a daily strip, like Peanuts was part of your life in my generation. And we sat there and he was like an hour late showing up for breakfast, and the waitress could tell we were like the cartoonist nerds. And she walked by and she's like, Sparky's running a little bit late today, guys. And eventually, when we got up the nerve to finally go over and talk to him when he did arrive, we stood there and listened to him for a while. And him and the manager of the place were grousing about a game that they'd played like the night before, like a seniors hockey game, and about like the people. And I was like, he sounds kind of grumpy. Maybe we should just leave. And we were like, well, we're never going to get a chance to meet Charles Schultz ever again. And so we both were like, hey, like I'd never been so nervous to introduce myself to a person. And we were just, he looked at us, and then the second we said we were cartoonists, everything about him changed. It was like, because clearly he couldn't get through a day there without tourists showing up and dragging him outside. He said the Japanese tourists would drag him outside to take pictures in front of the banners of Snoopy and stuff all the time. I was like, well, you could say no. but it's like the only time I've asked someone for their autograph in my life, and I totally regretted doing it, but I just didn't know what else to say to him. But it took him so long to sign his autograph because he had that shaky thing. But then when we were leaving, like he came out to his car, we were getting in our car, and we were trying to figure out what he'd be driving, which by the way, it was next year's Jag. Sure. It was not the station wagon I was sure was Charles Schultz's car. He's opening the trunk of his car, and for a second I'm like, he's going to show us that he's got a shotgun and not to bother him again or something. And on the fucking spare tire in the trunk of his car is a Sunday page he took home to work on over the weekend. And he showed us the pens that he used because he bought like the pen was going out of, the company was going to go out of business. So he bought like 1 million of them or something in the 60s. He let us hold his pens and hold the art and look at it. And he was like looking over it and he's like, I really messed up that line. And I was just like, this guy is the greatest living cartoonist of all time. And all he can talk about is how he's still trying to get better and not good. Oh, this isn't good enough. And oh, I don't like the way that grass looks. And, like I just was just like, oh, it never fucking ends. Like, I remember that last interview with him on 60 Minutes when he talked about how he wished he could have drawn like the guy who did Captain Easy. And I was like, what are you talking about, man? You were so much better than that guy. And I love Captain Easy. But yeah, it was just like, man, cartoonists are, they're all the fucking same from the top one down to the lowliest guy doing a zine. You only see the stuff that you're like, I wish I'd drawn that panel better.
There's a lesson there for sure.
Yeah, I'll say.
Yeah.
You good, Jimmy?
I am.
Ed, thanks so much for coming by. How do we point people to the newsletter or whatever else you want to promote at this point?
I recently got Image to, if you go to my bio page on the Image Comic website, there's a link to join my newsletter.
Awesome.
Because I had no way to get people to join it for the last 5 years, and people were still joining it somehow. So I think just people sharing it. I would often find myself unsubscribed to it accidentally somehow. So. I think someone who I maybe forwarded one to unsubscribed me while subscribing themselves. So, but yeah, just my bio page on the Image Comics website. And yeah. Well, thanks for having me, guys. I love talking about comics with people who actually love comics and know a lot about the history of comics and stuff. And I wanted to ask you questions about your influences, actually. Do we have a minute? Can I talk to you?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So, Don Rosa at all as a kid?
Oh, little bits, but not really the Duck comics, if that's what you're
Yeah. No. I was thinking the stuff he did before that, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay, because I always saw a tiny amount. I was like, is this my imagination? Because you could develop an art style that looks exactly like yours without that. There's some guy who draws comics now who I couldn't believe did not like grow up reading Bernie Moreau comics, but he'd never heard of the guy before. I'm like, you have his exact ink line.
You see that stuff, man, and sometimes when you make those implications, people are like, "Who is that?" Mm-hmm. And
yeah,
it's like, what, really?
Yeah, something about the way your compositions and ink lines occasionally would remind me of like those old Pertwillaby paper stuff. I remember getting those from Fantagraphics when I was like a teenager.
Just because we brought his name up, and yeah, like that's some of the early Fanta comics I got. There at least was this series of YouTube videos where they're going through Don Rosa's house and showing off his collection and original art and stuff. It's pretty freaking cool, man.
Oh man, I should look that up.
Yeah. He's got a giant house, got a lot of ephemera, a lot of cool original art, beautiful studio.
Yeah. My friends were all in Portugal with him one year at the art festival in Porto, and they actually built Uncle Scrooge's money bin for the room that had all the Don Rosa art. It actually had like a sculpture of Scrooge diving into the money bin and money splashing up. Like they go all out in Portugal.
They take that shit for real everywhere but here. Like where was it?
Oh yeah.
It was a festival in Germany where it happened to be the 70th birthday of Donald Duck. They shut the festival down. And it was almost like pallbearers, really. It was 6 people with a giant like piece of plywood with like the biggest cake I've ever seen in my entire life, because they wanted to cut little slabs for everybody at the festival after.
Oh, that's amazing.
After singing "Happy Birthday" to Donald Duck in German.
That's insane. Whereas at Comic-Con you go and you're like, oh, here's a thing for a TV show that has nothing to do with comics that's a huge display outside my hotel for some reason.
and one more, like in Denmark, it's all coming back to me.
Oh yeah.
In Denmark, it was the first time I ever went abroad. Like I literally got my passport to like go to Denmark to this festival. It's me, it's Frank Quitely, Dan Klaus, Charles Burns, Chris Ware, Don Rosa.
Oh wow.
And when we're over there, it's like we're all, going off doing whatever we're supposed to do. And then I'm just checking things out, take a little bathroom break or whatever. You see the biggest line in the whole joint. Is it Frank Whiteley? Is it Chris Ware? Is it Charles Burns? It's not. It's Don Rosa.
Yeah.
And
he apparently couldn't walk down the streets in some Scandinavian countries because his picture was in the paper so many times. He was like super famous as the new duck guy after Barks. But yeah. I mean, I can't imagine that. Like, I feel weird getting recognized at the airport on the way home from Comic-Con. Just like really the only place I get recognized. Every now and then, like, someone will come over to do something at the house or something, like to fix something, and they'll be like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'm like, "Oh, I write comic." And then I'm like, "Oh, I used to write Captain America. I did that Winter Soldier thing." And then people flip out about that. And I met one of my neighbors recently walking down the street, and my wife and I were talking to him, and he's like, "Ed, you're actually my hero." And for a second, my ego started to bloat up because I thought he was about to say that he was a huge fan of my comics. This guy's like 10 years older than me. And it turned out I was his hero because I walked down the street smoking a joint. So I was like, God damn it.
My dad is super impressed that we're talking to the guy who wrote Westworld.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other nightmare. It had 7 timelines originally. Oh, not really. It had 5. Well, all right, man.
We could keep this going forever, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your guys' show, and thanks for having me on it. I was so thrilled to see you were branching outside of, more talented people than me.
You know what we got to do sometime, man, because talking comics with you is super fun. If you come back one time when we got the camera face down, we could break out some kind of cool comic, like rather than share something in your newsletter about a meaningful comic. How about we break one of those out and just get deep with it? I think that would be super fun.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, I would love to do that. Yeah, I love the craft stuff.